Hearst Castle might be the most famous historic home in America. It's certainly the most top-searched house tour in the entire country, the largest private residence on the entire West Coast, and one of the most extravagant private homes ever built in the whole world. Today, we're in San Simeon, California, stepping inside Hearst Castle. Built by media tycoon William Randolph Hearst and designed by pioneering architect Julia Morgan, this hilltop retreat welcomed Hollywood stars, politicians, royalty, and some of the most powerful people in the world, all who would come here to play, party, be seen, and soak up the magnificent art and beauty held within Hearst Castle. You've all been asking for this one, and it's finally here. I'm bringing you Hearst Castle in 2 parts. In this part 1, we're exploring the grand social rooms of Casa Grande, the assembly hall, the dining room, the library, the billiard room, and both of the castle's very famous pools. And next week, we'll be stepping in the more private side of the estate, including Hearst's private bedroom, the massive kitchen and pantry, and the guest houses and suites that hosted some of the most famous visitors in the world. Hi, I'm Allie, and welcome back to Fab Little Dish, where we celebrate the love for vintage home. If you love these historic house tours, then give this video a big thumbs up and show me some love in the comments below. Now let's step inside and learn more about one of the most famous homes in the world. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, the only child of George and Phoebe Hearst. His father, George Hearst, had almost no formal education, but he had a strong instinct for geology and mining and was largely self-taught. Contemporaries often described him as a natural miner, and after heading west during the California Gold Rush, he made some of the most richest mineral discoveries in American history, including the Comstock lode in Nevada and the Anaconda copper mine in Montana, which would eventually produce nearly a fifth of the world's copper, generating one of the greatest fortunes of the American West. George eventually entered politics, serving as a United States California senator. He wasn't really around much, he worked all of the time, so clearly William Hearst inherited his ambition and business instincts from his father, but he also inherited something entirely different from his mother. Phoebe Hearst was refined, intellectual, and deeply passionate about art, architecture, and culture. And William Hearst was very close to his mother, especially since his father wasn't really around when he was growing up. And that influence would shape the way Hearst saw the world and give him a softer side to his very strong presence. In 1865, George Hearst purchased a vast stretch of rugged coastal land known as the Piedra Blanca Rancho. The land had originally been granted to a Mexican ranchero in the 1840s, but after California became a state, many landowners struggled to retain their property following legal disputes and a devastating drought in the early 1860s. And George Hearst saw opportunity. He purchased tens of thousands of acres stretching from San Simeon Bay all the way north, eventually building what would become one of the largest private ranches in California. And you know that place from your childhood, the one you look back on with the happiest of memories? For William Randolph Hearst, this was that place. He spent time here camping with his mother, exploring the hills and coastline on horseback, overlooking the Pacific. So this place sat here as William Randolph Hearst kept himself busy and became a success. As a young man, he attended Harvard, where academics weren't exactly his main focus. What did capture his attention was publishing. Hearst became involved with the Harvard Lampoon, a satirical magazine where he began developing the storytelling instincts that would later define his career. Not long after not being asked to return back to Harvard, his father gave him control of a struggling newspaper he had purchased, the San Francisco Examiner, and Hearst transformed it. He introduced bold headlines, investigative reporting, and vivid storytelling, turning newspapers into something people didn't just read for information, but for entertainment. Readers loved it, and from that single newspaper, Hearst began building one of the most powerful media empires in the world. At its height, his empire included dozens of newspapers, magazines like Good Housekeeping, film production companies, radio networks, and eventually television, employing tens of thousands of people. In 1902, Hearst won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. And in the following year, in 1903, he married Millicent Wilson, a young 21-year-old New York socialite. Hearst was 40. And that same year, he took office in Congress, a position he would hold through 1907. Together, he and Millicent would have 5 sons. Millicent had originally been a chorus performer on the stages of New York when Hearst first met her in the 1890s. She was lively, ambitious, and more than a decade younger than he was. As Hearst's empire grew, Millicent became an important figure in New York society, hosting political gatherings, supporting charitable causes, and helping to build the public image of the Hearst family. But their marriage would eventually become complicated, because in the years ahead, another woman would enter Hearst's life, the actress Marion Davies, and her presence would become inseparable from the story of Hearst Castle itself. But more on that later. Hearst and his wife, Millicent, never divorced officially. That would have been a nightmare in the papers. But over time, they began living separate lives entirely. Millicent remained in New York with their sons, while Hearst spent more and more time in California. So Hearst Castle became a point of contention between Hearst and his wife and his sons. But before it even came to be, he had never forgotten the hilltop overlooking the Pacific where he had spent a large part of his childhood. In 1919, his mother Phoebe died, and he inherits the land and the fortune that his father had originally given to his mother. So he finally decides to build something extraordinary here. What began as a simple idea for a hilltop retreat would grow into one of the most ambitious homes ever constructed in America. But Hearst knew he couldn't create this alone. If he was the dreamer behind this castle, then Julia Morgan was the genius who figured out how to build it. Hearst was around 54 years old when he decided to hire remarkable designer Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan was already very well respected in California, but the project Hearst was imagining here was unlike anything she had ever attempted before, or anyone else for that matter. The two first met in her San Francisco office to discuss building on the hilltop overlooking the Pacific. Soon after, they traveled here together to study the land and decide exactly where the house should sit so it could capture the sweeping views of both the mountains and the ocean. What Hearst wanted wasn't simply a mansion. He wanted something inspired by the architecture he had fallen in love with during his many trips to Europe. Gothic cathedrals, Italian Renaissance palaces, Moorish courtyards of southern Spain, and Morgan somehow had to translate all of those influences into a single estate rising from the hills of California. The two of them began what would become a remarkable creative journey together. Hearst was constantly purchasing architectural fragments, Renaissance ceilings, medieval gates, tapestries, ancient stonework, and furniture from across the world, and Morgan would design entire rooms around them. Their process was intensely collaborative. Hearst would sketch ideas and send notes, Morgan would respond with drawings and design studies, and slowly the vision for what they called the ranch began to take shape. The plan was very ambitious. A grand hilltop palace called Casa Grande, surrounded by 3 smaller guest houses arranged in a sweeping semicircle. But building something like this in such a remote location and filling it with all of these amazing things would prove to be an enormous challenge. And for the next 2 decades, Julia Morgan would oversee one of the most extraordinary architectural projects in American history. And in next week's video, we will dig much deeper into why Julia Morgan is truly as remarkable as she is in the world of design and architecture. Set among more than 250,000 acres of wilderness, a parcel of land a little larger than the state of Rhode Island, Hearst Castle, officially known as La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill, a name Hearst came up with from his childhood memories of coming here with his mother and camping out as a young boy. This ranch was sacred to him, and he wanted that feeling to be palpable. But building something like this in the early 1920s, on top of a remote hill overlooking the Pacific, was anything but simple. There were no proper roads, no nearby infrastructure, and certainly no easy way to transport the enormous amount of materials Hearst needed in order for his dream to come true. Entire roads had to be built to reach the site. A private dock was constructed at San Simeon so ships could unload building materials, antiques, and supplies from all around the world. From there, everything had to be hauled up the mountains. Hearst even built an airstrip on the ranch, allowing planes to fly guests and deliveries directly onto the estate. Craftsmen, engineers, laborers, and artists were brought in from all over, along with food, housing, tools, and equipment that was required to support a small working community on the hill. As you can imagine, constructing Hearst Castle became one of the largest private building projects ever attempted in California. Even the materials used to build the castle were revolutionary for the time. Although Casa Grande appears to be carved entirely from stone, the structure is actually poured concrete reinforced with steel. An intentional decision made by both Hearst and Julia Morgan. The two had both lived through the devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and they wanted to build a castle with the strongest structural system possible. And Julia Morgan was the brains behind that one. She didn't just design the buildings, she oversaw nearly every single aspect of the construction. She supervised craftsmen, sourced the materials, coordinated shipments arriving in from Europe, and managed the enormous workforce required to keep the project moving. She was also the interior designer, personally overseeing the designs of the tiles, entrances, fountains, ceilings, and carved architectural elements throughout the estate. And she was always on the hunt as well. At one point, she discovered a shipment of rare teakwood available in San Francisco, and she immediately purchased it. She hired craftsmen to transform it into the elaborate carvings that still decorate the eaves of Casa Grande today. And that's also where William Randolph Hearst's bedroom is. Workshops were set up right here on the hilltop, where artisanal craftsmen created stonework, ironwork, and wood carvings right here on site. The entire place functioned almost like a self-sustaining creative factory. Hearst also maintained one of the largest private zoos in the world right here on this ranch. Zebras, giraffes, ostriches, elephants, llamas, lions, tigers, and bears all lived right here on the property. Some roamed freely across on the hillsides. Others were kept in dedicated enclosures to be safe. Hearst had always loved animals. He even ordered that leftover food scraps be scattered for the mice that lived around the property. The ranch was also incredibly productive. There were also thousands of cattle grazing on the surrounding land, along with vegetable gardens, poultry operations, and dairy facilities that helped supply food for the guests, workers, and the massive estate itself. This place was incredibly self-sustaining, and for its time and location, that was incredible. As you drive up the mountain, the castle was designed to reveal itself slowly, appearing and disappearing through the hills as you approach it. And when you finally reach the top of the hill, you're greeted by the grand staircase. At the center sits the Venus fountain, crowned by a white marble sculpture of the birth of Venus, created by the Parisian sculptor Charles Cassou. Venus, the Roman goddess of love, known to the Greeks as Aphrodite, rises from the water, welcoming visitors as they begin the climb towards the house. But nothing here quite captures the spirit of Hearst Castle like the Neptune Pool. The Neptune Pool is one of the most famous swimming pools in the whole world. The pool is framed by the facade of a Greco-Roman temple. Many of the columns and capitals surrounding the pool date from between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, giving the space an extraordinary sense of history and grandeur. The pool itself is made of gleaming white marble, much of it brought in from Vermont, and it holds more than 345,000 gallons of water, filled by mountain springs. Originally heated by oil furnaces, the pool allowed guests to swim comfortably even out in the cool coastal air. But like many parts of Hearst Castle, the Neptune Pool didn't appear exactly like this from the beginning. Hearst famously changed his mind constantly during construction. The pool was redesigned 3 times, where one construction would be entirely demolished to be rebuilt as his ideas evolved. By the mid-1930s, the grand facade and marble colonnades were added, transforming the pool into the extraordinary space that we see today. And look at this gorgeous coffered ceiling, rosettes in every panel, crisp classical molding, and these ionic columns lining the colonnade, wrapping the pool like a temple. It truly is magical here. Every single time I come to Hearst Castle, there's something about this pool that simply draws you in. The sculptures surrounding the pool add another layer of beauty to the overall scenery. And in the center fountain stands the Birth of Venus, a marble sculpture depicting the Roman goddess of love rising from the sea. And this is supposed to give you a very theatrical impression. The pool's designed to feel almost like a stage. And here was a great view of the pool that our guide took us to that was off to the side and up the landing after you went up the stairs. This really shows you the whole frame of the pool's incredible design, and it really is quite a sight. And here we are on the main terrace, right at the heart of the central plaza. Julia Morgan designed this space to be almost like a pause in between performances, a place to reflect on what you've just seen and what you're about to take in as we make our way up towards the gardens in Casa Grande. Julia Morgan created an ever-changing series of gardens here. Enormous amounts of soil had to be hauled up the mountain. Enough rich topsoil to cover nearly 50 acres 5 feet deep. That soil allowed the creation of the gardens and terraces that we now see here. It softens the architecture and frames the buildings across the estate. One of the most important elements tying everything together is the esplanade. This long terrace connects the guest houses with the main building, guiding visitors through the property while visually linking the architecture with the gardens and the views of the surrounding hills and ocean. As you move through the grounds, sculptures appear almost everywhere. Many were brought here from Europe, some centuries old, and others 19th century reproductions that Hearst collected during his travels. Near the terraces, you'll find statues of the 3 Graces, classical figures representing beauty, charm, and grace. Throughout the estate, there are also several marble sarcophagi, ancient Roman-style stone coffins decorated with elaborate carvings and mythological scenes. It's crazy to see these out here as yard decor. Hearst loved incorporating pieces like this into the landscape, allowing fragments of classical history to blend into the nature here. And surrounding the Great House are 3 guest houses arranged in a sweeping semicircle below the main terrace, each one designed with its own view and character. But we will step inside these in next week's Hearst Castle Tour. Trust me, they are each a feast for your eyes. And then, rising above the terraces and gardens, you finally see it. Casa Grande, the great house, perched high above the plaza. Its twin bell towers immediately command your attention, rising nearly 140 feet above the terrace below. The design was inspired by a Spanish cathedral, Santa Maria la Mayor Cathedral, whose towers Hearst admired during his travels. Those twin towers are the visual signature of Casa Grande. They are what turns this into an enchanted castle on a hill the second you see it. They're modeled after a real Spanish cathedral tower, the Church of Santa Maria la Mayor in Ronda, Spain. And next week, I'm going to be showing you inside of those 2 guest suites that are up inside of those towers. They are simply magical. Although the exterior appears to be carved entirely from stone, Casa Grande is actually built from reinforced poured concrete, an incredible modern construction method at the time, again, to make sure this place could withstand any earthquake, which it has. As you move closer towards it, you start to see how intensely layered the facade is. There's different carvings and moldings on every single inch. On the facade are Spanish limestone reliefs depicting St. Peter and St. Paul, dating around to the 1520s, which Hearst purchased in 1923 and installed right here as part of the castle's exterior. And this front door is actually a 16th century Spanish iron gate, gilded to appear as if it's made of gold. Look at this little ramp at the reflecting pond on the main terrace. This allowed his dachshunds to hop in and out of the water on a hot day. Their little legs needed some help. Casa Grande contains 115 rooms spread across 4 floors, including 38 bedrooms, 42 bathrooms, and 14 sitting rooms. The house also includes the Grand Assembly Hall, the Refectory dining room, the library, gothic study, a billiard room, a private movie theater, the main kitchen and pantry, and a separate dining room for the staff. Construction of the main house began in the early 1920s, with the south service wing being added in 1924 and the north wing beginning in 1929. As the estate continued to expand, construction evolved over many years. By the mid-1920s, the Enchanted Hill became the place to be in the entire world, and you wanted to be invited to a party here. And Hearst hosted an extraordinary parade of visitors: Hollywood stars, political leaders, writers, industrialists, artists, gossip columnists. Some guests joke that Hearst collected fascinating people the same way he collected art. They came to see the castle and to be seen here. Among the many famous visitors were aviator Amelia Earhart, Rita Hayworth, actor Charlie Chaplin, playwright George Bernard Shaw, and Winston Churchill, along with countless others from Hollywood and high society. Life here followed its own rhythm. Days were relaxed. Guests could ride on horseback through the surrounding hills, swim through the pools, play tennis on the courts, explore the gardens through the terraces. And in the evenings, everyone gathered again inside the castle for cocktails, dinner, and films in Hearst Private Theater. Everything here was meant to be an experience, and for a time, it was one of the most fascinating social worlds in America. This place was designed to keep Hearst young, and someone that kept him young here was actress Marion Davies. She was a vibrant, quick-witted, and a gifted comedian who quickly charmed nearly everyone she met, especially William Randolph Hearst. He was captivated by her energy, and over time she became the unofficial hostess of the castle, helping welcome guests from around the world and helping to keep them entertained throughout all hours of the evening. Visitors now enter through this side door, specifically to protect the delicate mosaic floor behind this gate, which is actually referred to as the convent gate. And this is where your evening at Hearst Castle would begin. Right here in the assembly room. It's one of the largest rooms in Casa Grande, measuring more than 80 feet long and over 30 feet wide, with a ceiling rising nearly 24 feet above the floor. Quickly over to the left, where you can see that scaffolding, is the main entrance. During my visit, they were doing some preservation work here, and it's a good reminder that this place is constantly being cared for so the original surfaces can survive for generations to come. But what's crazy is that back in the day, you used to be able to walk across that tile mosaic floor in the entryway. Our guide mentioned that visitors used to enter across this original mosaic floor until it became too delicate from foot traffic. As relaxed as your days were here as a guest, the evenings had some requirements attached to them. All guests were required to gather here so the night could begin with their host and the rest of the guests. William Randolph Hearst would eventually appear through this private elevator of his, which he jokingly referred to as my little trick. Only after Mr. Hearst's arrival would the evening truly begin. Cocktails were served, guests chatted, played games, and slowly moved into the rhythm of the evening before dinner was announced. Dominating the far wall is a massive 16th century stone fireplace mantel, originally from a chateau in Burgundy, France. Above and around the room hang 4 enormous Flemish tapestries from the 1500s. They were once part of a French royal collection under Louis XIV and hung in the Palace of Versailles before being sold after the French Revolution. I love how there's always connections to Versailles and many of the homes I visit. It's almost like the palace is following me. Lining the walls are intricately carved Italian Renaissance choir stalls, wooden seats that originally came from European monasteries, repurposed here as decorative paneling. What's remarkable about the assembly hall is how harmoniously all of these elements come together, where art and history are meant to be experienced together. And when dinner was ready, an announcement would be made and guests would move into this room, the Refectory. The name itself comes from medieval monasteries, where monks gathered for communal meals, and Hearst intentionally designed this room to feel like an old European dining hall. And it really does feel like that, doesn't it? Around 9 o'clock in the evening, guests would take their seats at the long refectory table. Where you sat depended on how recently you had arrived. Newer guests would be placed closer to Hearst. The longer you stayed, the farther down the table you would eventually move. Hearst himself sat in the center of the table, with Marion Davies seated directly across from him. When one guest, who was apparently a Vanderbilt, asked why he didn't sit at the head of the table, Hearst famously replied, "I am the head of the table." The room itself is enormous, nearly 2,000 square feet of space beneath a spectacular carved wooden ceiling. All of the ceilings in here are works of art and take my breath away. He collected them, and you can tell. This one is made up of 15 large panels depicting a bunch of different religious figures, 12 saints, the Virgin Mary, and 2 coats of arms. It's one of the many examples of Hearst incorporating historic and religious architectural elements directly into the design of the house. But perhaps the most colorful feature of the room hangs along the walls. These dramatic banners come from the 13 contrade of Siena, Italy, the small little districts within this little Tuscan hillside town, who each compete against one another in a famous palio horse race. And fun fact, I actually studied abroad in this little Tuscan town, Siena, when I was in college, so this absolutely ignited a sense of nostalgia and excitement within me, a feeling that I'm sure others also feel in countless other parts of this estate. Hearst collected these flags during his travels and displayed them here to bring in color to the enormous stone walls, and that they do. Beneath these banners, dinner would unfold. The table could seat as many as 64 guests, Despite the glamorous setting and all of the partying that happened here, Hearst ran these experiences for his guests with surprisingly firm rules. He disliked excessive drinking. Guests who indulged too heavily might find themselves not ever invited back to San Simeon. The atmosphere was meant to be lively, but never chaotic or in bad taste. Conversation, good food, and the company of fascinating people were the real focus here for each and every party. And this is the morning room, a softer and more quiet alternative side to everything else we've been seeing. Unlike the grand halls used for entertaining, this was a more intimate sitting room where guests could relax during the day, reading, writing letters, or enjoying conversation before the evening's festivities began. The room faces east, which means it fills with soft morning light as the sun rises over the hills behind the castle. And that gentle light beautifully highlights the room's medieval character. Morgan decorated the room with Spanish antiques and richly colored Flemish tapestries, creating layers of texture and warmth against the stone walls. Like many rooms in Casa Grande, the morning room was designed around historic architectural fragments that Hearst collected during his travels. Julia Morgan carefully incorporated these pieces into the designs of each of the rooms so they feel completely natural within each space, as if the room itself had been standing there for centuries, waiting for you to admire it. After dinner, the evening at Hearst Castle continued. Guests would often continue the night right here in the billiard room. The ceiling above is another remarkable piece of art, a 15th century Spanish wooden ceiling carved and painted centuries before it was ever installed here. But the true centerpiece is the space that hangs on the far wall. A massive Franco-Flemish tapestry known as the Hunt of the Stag. Woven sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century, the tapestry depicts a dramatic hunting scene. It's created in a style that we know as mille fleurs, or 1,000 flowers. Tapestries like this were originally produced for European courts and castles, both as decoration and as insulation against the cold stone walls. Here at Hearst Castle, the effect is similar. The enormous textile softens the room and adds warmth to the darker wood and stone surfaces all around it. During an evening at Hearst Castle usually ended here, in Hearst's private movie theater as your last stop. By the time guests arrived, the room would already be dimly lit, the walls glowing softly beneath the rich damask fabric-patterned walls. The theater itself is decorated in a classic Art Deco style with elegant large seating and sculptural plaster figures known as caryatids lining the walls. These classical female figures appear to hold the architectural elements above them, adding a theatrical touch that feels perfectly aligned with the function of this space. And cinema was something Hearst cared deeply about and wanted to express through the design of this room. By the 1920s, he had become heavily involved in the film industry through his company Cosmopolitan Productions. Many of the films he produced at the studio starred Marion Davies, whose career Hearst enthusiastically supported. Guests at the castle were often among the first people anywhere to see the newest films of his production company. And when the movie finally ended, Hearst would return to his private suite where he often was said to continue working way late into the night, reviewing papers, correspondences, and business matters. Meanwhile, Marion Davies frequently remained with the guests, continuing the conversations and laughter that had filled the castle all evening. Entertaining here wasn't just something that you experienced for a few hours and then went to sleep. This was a way of life, an experience of a lifetime, and Hearst wanted everyone to feel that way. And by the time visitors finally did retire for the night, they had experienced something that most people never, ever would. Right above the main entrance, between the towers, is the castle's main library. It sits directly above the assembly room, almost like a guest salon stacked on top of the grand hall below. This library was designed for Hearst's guests, and it stretches about 80 feet long, filled edge to edge with treasures. And like so many rooms here, it immediately feels layered, curated, and collected. And grounding the whole space is a massive Persian rug measuring 22 by 35 feet. Above us is a magnificent 16th century Spanish ceiling, and what's incredible is that it wasn't originally one single ceiling. Julia Morgan assembled multiple ceiling sections here into one cohesive design, almost like a giant puzzle. Below it, the walls are lined with walnut bookcases holding more than 4,000 books. Hearst had been collecting these since he was young, and even during his Harvard years, he was already building the beginnings of an impressive European and American literary collection. And even these bookcases, they were carved semi-locally in San Francisco, modeled and expanded after a design of a 16th century Florentine cabinet. And what's truly, truly impressive here is that the room holds about 115 ancient Greek vases, all more than 2,000 years old, pieces dating back roughly from the 8th to the 3rd centuries BC. I mean, that's just astonishing. It's just a really interesting feeling to be surrounded by so many of them. You feel like you're stepping back into history, yet you have a foot in the present day as well. It's a really fun balancing act that you're feeling throughout the entire experience at Hearst Castle. Huge. This library, too, was part of the experience that Hearst wanted his guests to have. A place where even a simple afternoon feels elevated, where you're surrounded by pieces of history that span centuries, not to mention the gorgeous views surrounding you. The library was the last public space in Casa Grande that we'll be seeing together on this tour today. We'll be coming back inside next week, but for now, let's continue on to some of the other recreational areas up on the hill. These are the tennis courts, and they saw a lot of action during Hearst's entertaining days here. This was one of the favorite places for guests to spend the afternoon. Just look at actress Carole Lombard out here, smoking a cigarette on the courts. Honestly, I can just feel how exciting this place must have felt, in every corner, at all times. And take note of these tiles because they actually go into the design of the next space that we're about to see together. And now we're walking down this pathway to another very iconic spot at Hearst Castle. And I'm not gonna lie, this is probably where I would have retreated to after the movie. The Roman pool. If the Neptune Pool outside felt like an ancient temple under the open sky, then this space feels like stepping right inside an ancient Roman bathhouse. And that's exactly what Hearst wanted this space to feel like. Everything in here is covered in shimmering tiles. The walls, ceiling, floors, creating an immersive mosaic of deep blues, blacks, and golds. The tiles themselves are made from Venetian glass, many of them infused with hammered gold leaf, which catch the light in ways that make the entire room glow. As sunlight filters through the water and the glass tile, the reflections ripple across the ceiling, creating an effect that feels almost otherworldly. Even the lighting was carefully designed. Soft alabaster lamps line the walls, casting a warm glow over the room that deepens the rich blues and golds of the tile. The result is something that feels like a sparkling jewel box. Surrounding the water are 8 marble statues of classical figures from Greek and Roman mythology, reinforcing the ancient inspiration of the space. Their white marble forms stand in striking contrast against the dark blues in the mosaic surfaces. The sun falls through skylights cut into the tennis court above and onto a diving platform high above the water. Another example of Julia Morgan's geniusness. Guests often would come here late at night after dinner in the films, when the pool was illuminated and the tiles shimmered beneath the water. In those moments, the Roman pool must have felt almost dreamlike. A glittering underground world beneath the tennis courts of the Enchanted Hill. It's one of the most extraordinary spaces in the entire castle, and it always leaves me with just a lasting impression that I can't describe. It really is a perfect example of how Hearst and Julia Morgan transformed centuries of classical inspiration into something entirely unique and extraordinary. And that's really what makes Hearst Castle so fascinating. It isn't just the scale of the place, or how extraordinary all the art is that fills each and every corner of each and every room. It's the fact that all of this was created on a remote hill above the Pacific, piece by piece, through the imagination of William Randolph Hearst and the brilliance of architect Julia Morgan. Together, Hearst and Morgan transformed what had once been a rugged ranch campsite from Hearst's childhood into something completely spectacular. In many ways, Hearst Castle is not just a monument to one man's ambition, it's the life's work of one of the most extraordinary architects America has ever produced. We've just experienced the grand public side of Hearst Castle. The rooms where guests gathered, dined, spent their evenings together. So next week's adventure is going to show a little more personal side of the whole estate. The private suites and guest cottages, the kitchens that kept this enormous estate running, and the rooms where Hearst himself lived and worked late into each night while the parties continued on here. So make sure to subscribe, because trust me, what I'll be showing you is absolutely incredible. And let me know in the comments below if you have any suggestions on where I should head to next. I am always looking for new ideas. And for our next good chunk of different house tours coming up, I will be outside of California, traveling across the country, bringing a whole bunch of special places your way. But thank you for being here for this one with me. And until next week, when we experience part 2 of Hearst Castle, keep enjoying the beauty of vintage home. Au revoir.